On July 8, 1967, William Kennedy Shearer, the eventual chairman of the Constitution Party, alongside his wife Eileen Nolan Shearer, teamed up with the 45th governor of Alabama, George Wallace, to create a new political party to get the paleoconservative Dixiecrat voters of yesteryear to support a candidate that was open for segregation. It, of course, became the American Independent Party. Wallace was their ideal candidate since he was an openly segregationist governor.
And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
Who became a national figure when he attempted to block the racial integration of the University of Alabama. Oh, not with legislation, I mean literally. He also ran as a Southern Democratic candidate in 1964, getting 10.8% of the vote in the primary. Air Force General Curtis LeMay was selected to be his running mate. Wallace and LeMay managed to get on the ballot in all 50 states. Wallace was very strategic throughout his political career. Even his stances on segregation seemed to be just demagogic rhetoric. 1968 was no exception. When he campaigned in the South, he talked about states' rights and combating communism, but when he campaigned in the North, he talked about the concentration of wealth in the political elite. Those strategies helped him win over white Southerners and blue-collar workers in the North. Wallace even took an interesting stance on the Vietnam War, saying that if it wasn't winnable within the first 90 days of his administrations, he'd immediately withdraw all troops from Vietnam. LeMay, however, wanted to nuke the Gooks. Wallace even earned himself endorsements from Louisiana Representative John Rorick, Georgia Governor Lester Maddox, and MLK's assassin, James Earl Ray, who actually committed the assassination because he was convinced that when Wallace became president, he'd get pardoned. Wallace's plan was not to win the presidency directly. His plan was to deadlock the Electoral College so that the House would have to vote for the president, where he'd have more bargaining power. Despite both parties trying to paint Wallace as a radical, Wallace managed to attain 13.35% of the popular vote and 46 electoral votes, much like the 1948 Dixiecrat Strom Thurmond. In 1969, a comparatively more moderate group formed within the AIP called the American Party, with a platform of paleoconservatism and nativism. We'll get back to them later. In 1972, it was expected that George Wallace would run again for the American Independent Party, but Wallace chose to run as a Democrat, possibly attributed to Nixon investigating Wallace and his administration for tax fraud in order to pressure him not to split the conservative vote. The AIP still found a suitable candidate in Republican Representative John G. Schmitz, who represented California's 35th District, who, after talking trash about Nixon, was beaten by a more moderate Republican, Andrew J. Hinshaw, who was personally recruited by Nixon to unseat Schmitz. Author Thomas J. Anderson was nominated to be his running mate. Both of them were known for being a part of the far-right John Birch Society, though Schmitz was expelled for extremist rhetoric. He was on the ballot in 32 states and managed to get 1.42% of the popular vote, significantly less than George Wallace, but still very sizable. After this election, the American Party left the AIP to become its own political party, which I cannot go into in this video. In the 1976 election, the AIP had 3 people run for their nomination: Chief Counsel to the U.S. Senate Subcommittee on Internal Security, Robert G. Morris, Louisiana Representative John Rarick, and former Georgia Governor Lester Maddox, the governor before Jimmy Carter and Carter's lieutenant governor. Maddox won the nomination, and he said his reason for running was that Maddox thought Carter was, quote, the most dishonest man I've ever met. He chose 2-term mayor of Madison, Wisconsin, William Dyke, to be his running mate. Despite Dyke's disagreement with the AIP on segregation, they managed to receive 0.21% of the popular vote. Later in the 1980 election, 2 candidates ran for the AIP nomination. They were American Party presidential candidate Percy L. Greaves Jr. and Louisiana Representative John Rarick. Rarick won the nomination, and the AIP founder Eileen Shearer was selected to be his running mate. They managed to receive 0.05% of the popular vote. In the 1984 election, the AIP chose to endorse Populist Party candidate and Olympic athlete Bob Richards for president and Maureen Kennedy Solomon for vice president. Interesting history, from the first athlete on a Wheaties box to running for president under 2 white nationalist parties, they managed to receive 0.07% of the popular vote. Later in 1988, the AIP nominated perennial candidate from California and founding AIP member James C. Griffin for president and future California gubernatorial candidate Charles Morsa as his running mate. They managed to receive 0.03% of the popular vote. In 1992, after pretty much abandoning the party's segregation as past, the AIP chose to become the state affiliate of the U.S. Taxpayers Party. While you may have already seen all this stuff before in my video about the U.S. Constitution Party, I feel that it would be best to go over it again here for consistency reasons. In 1992, their candidate was Howard Phillips for president and Bishop Albion Knight Jr. for vice president. They managed to receive 0.04% of the popular vote. Then in 1996, they chose to endorse again the U.S. Taxpayers Party ticket comprising of Howard Phillips for president and lawyer Herbert Titus for vice president. They managed to get 0.19% of the popular vote. Then, in the controversial election of 2000, the AIP chose to again endorse the Constitution Party candidate of Howard Phillips for president and 1998 Senate candidate Curtis Frazier for vice president. They managed to receive 0.09% of the popular vote. Then, in the 2004 election, even though Phillips chose not to run again, they chose to endorse Michael Perotuka for president and Pastor Chuck Baldwin for vice president. However, they were also endorsed by the League of the South, so white supremacy still kind of rears its head in the party. They managed to receive 0.12% of the popular vote. During the 2008 election cycle, there was a split with the American Independent Party over who their chairman was. One faction recognized Jim King as the party chairman, and the other faction recognized Ed Noonan as their chairman. The King faction chose to become the California affiliate of the Constitution Party and endorsed Chuck Baldwin. We'll get back to what the Noonan faction was doing later. During this debate, the American Independent Party held a primary in California to decide who their candidate would be. The ones who participated in this primary were Constitution Party candidate Max Rice, 1996 American Party presidential candidate Dianne Bell Templin, and perennial AIP and Constitution Party candidate Don J. Grundmann. Grundmann won the primary, but these smaller paleoconservative parties usually choose a different candidate at the convention, and the aforementioned controversy over leadership led the Noonan faction, which comprised of 8 out of 17 of the AIP officers, choosing to leave the Constitution Party and decided to join up with the newly created America's Independent Party, which had been founded by supporters of the Constitution Party campaign of Alan Keyes, a huge step forward from the party founded upon the idea to uphold segregation. Minister and radio host Wiley Drake was selected to be his running mate. They managed to receive 0.04% of the popular vote. In 2011, due to problems between the two factions, there was a court case deciding whether or not the AIP would join with the Constitution Party or join with the newly rebranded America's Party, and on August 29th, it was decided that the AIP would become the California faction of the America's Party, while still being electorally independent. To show their electoral independence, they fielded 3 candidates for their nomination: Max Rice, making a comeback from 2008, radio host and Constitution Party candidate Lori Roth, and party chairman Ed Noonan. Noonan won the primaries, but 14 members of the AIP committee chose to halt Noonan's campaign and chose to endorse America's Party candidate activist Tom Hoefling for president, but rather than endorsing J.D. Ellis, they chose AIP activist Robert Ornless to be his running mate. In response to this, Noonan left the party and created the American Resistance Party. They managed to receive 0.03% of the popular vote. In 2016, we saw a rise in paleoconservatism, with one of the major candidates of the two major parties espousing many paleoconservative ideas. We'll get back to that in a second. But in response to this, the American Independent Party had 8 candidates filed to run and get their nomination. They were America's Party candidate Tom Hoefling, Prohibition Party candidate James Hedges, Alan Keyes running mate in 2008 Wiley Drake, perennial Constitution Party candidate J.R. Myers, AIP VP nominee in 2012 Robert Ornless, Arthur Harris, and Alan Spears. Now, even though Spears won the primary, apparently someone else got more write-in votes for the AIP primary than any of the other candidates. That candidate being Donald John Trump. Mike Pence was of course nominated to be his running mate. 46.09% of the popular vote and 304 electoral votes, and is technically the highest showing for the American Independent Party in the U.S. presidential elections if you count endorsements. Now, one more interesting fact before I go. It is currently the 3rd largest political party in California. Now, even though it is the third largest political party in California, it has very low voter turnout. Why is that? Well, a study showed that many people actually saw that people who were trying to register as independent voters accidentally registered as the American Independent Party. I know this for a fact because of my personal life. Someone I knew put their party affiliation on Facebook as American Independent Party, even though their views radically differed. And with that, we've reached the most recent developments of the American Independent Party. So to all of you reactionary, paleo-conservative neo-Dixiecrats, good luck. You know what, never mind. Thanks for watching this video. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and click that bell to be notified when a future video of mine comes out. And if you're interested in more political content from me, you can go to my website, follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Quora. What are your thoughts on the American Independent Party? Do you think they should exist, or do you think they should be banned? Let me know in the comment section below.